do a hand around a headset, and I was like, we better bring some wipes, like hand sanitizer. Yeah, we're very thankful to be here in this space. I work at Adobe, so yeah, thank you. Thanks to me. Thanks to Adobe. Yeah, so it's where we're going to be located from here on out in the new year in 2020, and they've been incredibly gracious in helping organize, get set up. So thank you, Adobe. I'm like knocking out Joseph's items on his sponsor list. Okay, good. This is like a Zen moment.
Last chance for bathroom.
Yeah, right. The guest Wi-Fi is not available right now. I'm sorry. We're good? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to introduce Joseph, who's going to introduce Indira.
All right. Hello. I'll speak into the mic, no worries. I broke my hand, and my system just had a critical restart, so forgive me if none of those things would affect this. All right, welcome to Accessibility New York's March meetup, everybody. Thank you all for coming, especially with the rain and impending doom. My name is Joseph Pevsner. I'm one of the co-hosts for the LIVESTREAM meetup. I'd like to thank my other co-hosts in the room, Jolly McAfee of the Open Internet Accessibility Special Interest Group, Cameron Cundiff of Adobe, who you have all met, and then not in the room but are also co-hosts for tonight, Mirabai Knight of White Coat Captions, who's creating these awesome captions, Sean Laureate of Google, and Stacy Smith and Thomas Logan of Equal Entry. So first and foremost, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Adobe and Adobe Design, who give us this wonderful space, Equal Entry, Level Access, ThoughtBot, who is no longer giving us their space, but is still helping us with all of the setup. And last thing I wanted to mention is take a look out on our socials and meetup page. We're going to be launching an accessibility VR meetup that will be held every month or two, but look out for the first one in mid-March. Now, without further ado, I am very excited to welcome our presenter today, Miss Indira Knight of the Royal College of Arts Hamlin Center for Design. I'm so sorry. Welcome, Indira, and thank you so much.
Hi, so I'm Indra, and I work at the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design in London, so it's in the Royal College of Art. And for the last year and a half, I've been working on a project, a VR therapy project, which included working with people with lived experience of psychosis in the co-design. So the project's called Game Change, and it's a virtual reality therapy for people with psychosis to make them feel more confident in everyday situations. They found that they did a recent audit. They recommend that people with psychosis and their families get some sort of psychological therapy. But when they did an audit of one of the NHS trusts in the UK, they found only 5% of people receiving it. And so we're hoping that this VR therapy will make it more accessible and more available initially in the UK, but hopefully it can go worldwide. So I don't know if people know what psychosis is, but I'll read that's a mental health problem that causes people to perceive or interpret things differently from those around them. So it might involve hallucinations or delusions. So this could be really strong beliefs that aren't true, or it could be hearing voices, seeing things, or even sort of touch and smell hallucinations. And this can happen for a number of reasons. It can happen with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder. It can happen with certain diseases like Alzheimer's and due to sort of drug and alcohol. And people with a diagnosis of psychosis often find it difficult to go out because they feel very anxious about being outside in social situations. This can be because they fear for their own safety, or they fear they might have an episode and for the safety of others. They sort of interpret how people are looking at them, which could be threatening. So there's a lot of reasons people do get anxious. And this can lead to social isolation, which again in turn leads to further medical problems or more physical problems. So the Game Change project, it was actually funded by the National Institute of Health Research in the UK for £4 million. It's a 3-year project, currently in its 2nd year, and at the moment it's in clinical trials with 332 people. It's actually being led by the University of Oxford along with the Oxford NHS Trust. And as you can see, we've actually got quite a lot of partners working on it. I've been working on the design and development side, so we've mainly been working with Oxford VR, who are actually building the application, with the McPinn Foundation, who are sort of advocates for people with mental health, and with Oxford, with the psychologists at Oxford. But we've also worked with the NHS Trusts and the other groups in the partnership. So just to briefly let you know more about the project, there are actually 4 work packages. I say there's the design and the development that I've been working on, but there's also looking at implementation and clinical adoption, establishing the clinical benefits of the VR treatment, and assessing the cost effectiveness. So this will happen over the whole 3 years. Let you know a bit about the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design. I'm based in Battersea. It's sort of in the Kensington area of London. It's the Royal College of Art is, I think, one of the only postgraduate only colleges in the world looking at art, but also mainly a lot around design as well. The Helen Hamlin Centre, on this project, we were leading the work package 1, which is the design and development, and that's partly because our involvement from the outset of around inclusive design. So the centre itself is about 30 years old and was established on the sort of ethos of inclusive design, and it came out of ideas that have been going on for sort of decades, but in the early 90s people sort of got these together and sort of called it inclusive design. And one of the people involved in this, there was a conference, a symposium of applied ergonomics in the early 90s, and there Roger Coleman talked about ageing and inclusive design for ageing, and he was one of the co-founders of our centre, the Helen Hamlin Centre. And it was really the idea that as there weren't very good facilities and good designs for older people, and how could they bring in young designers to work with older people, do co-design to create better designs and better products. And this has grown over the years, so now there's sort of areas in healthcare which I'm working in. We do a lot of work with neurodiversity and sort of different areas, but it's all about inclusive design, including people in the design process. And we publish a lot of our findings as well and make them available to people, so we try and sort of keep things open so it can sort of further knowledge. And just a couple of the other projects there I thought might be interesting to talk about that we've done. So there's one called Design in the Mind. So this is the Wellcome Foundation in the UK, and they've got a hub which is trying to be inclusive and get people working and engaging. And so a colleague of mine, Natasha, did some work with them to include the sort of the neurodiverse people in, they wanted to improve their approach to how to work with people with neurodiversity in engagement. And another one was How We See, which was working with the RNIB, and this was looking at inclusive design to help increase public understanding and attitudes towards eye health through the experience of the sight loss community. So that's the URL for the centre, and also I put in the URL underneath for, we publish a yearbook online at the moment, it's the 2018 one, but it shows all the different projects that are going on in the centre. So it's quite an interesting read to see what we've been working on. But now I'll go back to Game Change, and if I can, I'll see if I can show a video that sort of explains some of Game Change a bit. Just a minute. Unplug. Get Safari. Is that going to come up? Sorry, I'll just make that out. And if the sound's not good, then I'll stop it. But come through.
Sometimes people can't get out of the house to do something. They worry about it so much in themselves before they go out there, that is, that they feel they can't do it at all. So they avoid doing it.
is having like a pain in your chest all the time, is a heavy weight on your chest, and you feel like worried to meet somebody or to go to see a GP or to go on the bus. It's very hard.
I'd feel paranoid, I feel scared, it's about leaving the house.
It should be a good way to try out the things that you're scared of and sort of like learn that it's not as scary as it actually is.
I would say try and give it a go, and you can do it in your own pace, and you can change, you can stop when you like.
Yeah, I'd never done it before, so the first time I tried it I was like, whoa, this is really good. So it's fun, it's a fun thing to do, it's a fun concept. You put on the headset and you can see and you can hear all these different situations. So you use the virtual reality to help you with your thoughts and feelings and your confidence, and then when you go back into the real world you might feel a bit better.
And I'll say you're in this shop situation and then you start having some kind of worry, and then, I don't know, you find a way within the VR to overcome that worry. And maybe like when you're in the real world you have the exact same worry and you're like, right, what does I do in the VR? Oh, I did such a thing. And then you can try it in the real world, so you practice it over and over again in the VR.
Game change has basically been shaped in every aspect by the experiences of people who have psychosis. So fundamentally, people with lived experience have been involved in every area of the study, and they've been enormously influential. There is a group which has basically selected each of the different scenarios which are used in Game Change, including the GP surgery, the street, going to a pub, going to have a cup of coffee in a busy shopping centre. Those have all been selected by people with lived experience, and indeed what people do in those environments has also been massively influenced by workshops which have been held and meetings which have been held with people with lived experience of psychosis. So I think people with lived experience, I've just been astounded really by how much influence they've had, and it's been a pleasure to see just how quickly and how far things have come.
We're very excited about the Game Change VR therapy. It is an easy-to-use, step-by-step program to help people be more confident in everyday situations. But it's important we test it in a clinical trial to find out whether it works as we hope. 432 patients across 5 centres in England will take part in the Game Change trial. Half of the people taking part will receive the VR therapy and half will not. We then see how the people who've had the VR therapy get on compared with people who haven't had the VR therapy. Whether a person has the VR therapy is decided by chance. Everyone in the trial has an assessment at the beginning, which is then repeated after 6 weeks and 6 months. By the end of the Game Change trial, we will know whether we have a powerful new treatment for use with patients across the NHS.
Shut down the browser. See if it comes back up again. Yeah. So Game Change is based on psychological principles. So we work very closely with a psychologist at Oxford University, and they've done some work before around this. So it's the idea that people with psychosis, to cope with going outside, will create defence behaviours. But these defence behaviours aren't necessarily very healthy. So it might be things like only going out at certain times of day, or looking down when you go out, not making eye contact, wearing dark glasses, wearing a hat, and not really engaging with people. So it means that they're fears are sort of compounded because they're not seeing anything else. So psychologists will often take people with psychosis out to places they make them feel anxious and sort of get them to look around, get them to reassess their fears of being there, and hopefully they can then see that it is generally safe to be in those situations. It comes off the back of a sort of whole series of previous research, one that looked at automated psychological therapy to check that worked, and another which looked at the virtual reality of the treatment of persecutory delusions. So the therapy itself, as sort of said in that video, it is a self-contained therapy. So a virtual coach takes the person through the therapy. There are 6 different environments they can choose, which mentioned in the video. And for each environment, there are 5 levels. There's 5 different tasks that don't get cognitively more complicated, but get harder to be in. So you can imagine if you're in the pub, it starts off and it's fairly quiet and there's no one in there, or very few people in there. And the next level, there's more people, there's more sound. As the levels build up, there's more people, more noises around. And you might have to then interact with someone who might cause you anxiety. We're expecting people to do 6 sessions in this of about 30 minutes in the virtual reality. But I think it could be up to 8. And there's always a person with them. So there's always a support worker throughout while they're in the headset. So it's not something people would do on their own in the home. It is part of a therapy where they would have support, non-virtual support. And there are advantages to this. I don't know how many people here have used VR, but we often respond to it as we do in real life. So it means if we've created these environments, people will respond to them as they would in real life and feel those same anxieties. But it lets people try things out in a safe space and try out different ways to cope with that anxiety in this safe space. And they can repeat it as well. So if it's something particular that's worrying them, they can just repeat that particular task. So now I'm going to talk about the design, the co-design. So, as I said, we led Work Package 1, the design development, because of the history of our work with inclusive design and co-design. So it was really important for the development of this that it was the usability, it was engaging, and it was scalable. Those are sort of the things that would make it a success. And so for this, we worked with people with lived experience of psychosis. We worked with the psychologists, but we also worked with the developers as well. And it was sort of the criteria for designs were, did it meet the psychological principles of a therapy? Was it actually, we could build it in VR and we could build it in the time frame? We had a year to design and develop the VR for the clinical trial. And is it engaging? Is it relevant to people with psychosis? And it turned out to be quite an iterative process, which we didn't realise at the beginning that that's how it would be. We were doing the designs and building the product sort of at the same time, going through sort of multiple groups of people to get to that point. And so it sort of built up slowly from around June 2018, and we delivered the designs in December 2018 so they could be built out by the developers. This is a work in progress diagram. I'm trying to work out the structure of how we did it, and these arrows aren't quite right. When we first started, we knew we were going to have a lived experience advisory panel, and we knew we were going to have a workshops. But the rest of the sort of structure developed in the first month, really, as we got to know what we needed and how it worked, and it ended up working quite well. So I'll go through. We created 6 groups in the end that all worked together and separately, so they could meet separately and then feed into each other's groups. So the first one that we knew about was the Lived Experience Advisory Panel, and we were really lucky to work with the McPinn Foundation, one of the partners on this project, because they put together this panel, and it's running over all 3 years. It's working on all work packages, so it's people who are really invested in the project, who know the project, so there's continuity across the whole lot, and they meet 3 to 4 times a year. And they also, the first year though, we met with them 5 times, and they worked on, and I also had access to them remotely through the McPhin Foundation. So I sent a couple of questionnaires to get more information and more sort of feedback. So you can see the questionnaire here that I designed with a psychologist, asking what sort of characters people would find would cause them anxiety. Sort of, we need to find out things like that. So that was really helpful. And then we ran the workshops as well. So they We knew we were going to run 6 workshops, 5 in the cities where we were running the clinical trials and 1 in London. And these workshops would be people with lived experience of psychosis would come. We had quite a range of ages, of backgrounds, of male and female, because we wanted to get as many people as possible involved in this. And in the workshops, I'm sure most people here have been to sort of workshops, it was lots of post-it notes, it was any idea was fine, you know, there was nothing was wrong. But then we sort of gathered that all together. But then this was something we didn't plan for, was creating a working group. And this was partly because we had our design time shorter than we initially expected, and we wanted to get as much input as possible with people with lived experience. So the working group was based in London, and it had a number of people with lived experience of psychosis, plus us as the designers, the psychologists, and people from Oxford VR, the developers. And so while the workshops, it was sort of anything went, this was far more, can it be done? Is it relevant? And does it match the psychological principles? So having all those people in the room together meant that any idea could be discussed by all the relevant people, which meant we could really work through ideas faster. So when we had to get them signed off, we knew they'd already been checked by people with lived experience, by the developers. As designers, we'd check them, and with the psychologists. And there's an example of this. One of the tasks was going to be catching balloons. And then the developer said that's actually quite hard to do in virtual reality because you've got the physics of a balloon and the string looking real and then the person catching it, and in the short development time. So we knew we had to get rid of that idea. So that could happen really quickly. And then we had partners meetings. You can see the partners here who attended those. And this was where we presented the designs. We could discuss them, we could see what worked for everyone, what didn't work, ideas could get signed off. The deciders on the project were the psychologists from Oxford University, so they would be presented with all the designs. But there was a lot of discussion. It wasn't like they said, yes, we're having that, no. There was a lot of discussion around each of the designs in those meetings. And the other parts of the structure that I'm not going to talk about in detail was the subgroup and the implementation team. And the subgroup really was, there was 3 of us. I met with, on the phone, with someone from Oxford, one of the psychologists, and one of the developers from the development company. And it was just a weekly phone call where we could ask questions of each other. We could give information to them that they could disseminate through their organisation. And it was a quick way of getting messages back and forward between the different organisations. Oh, and I'd also talk about, we had an implementation team, which is sort of the same people, but that was actually running through how the designs would work and creating the design documentation. So I'll go into this in more detail in a bit, but this is just on the design of the coach, all the sort of show how iterative it is, all the ins and outs and all the different meetings that happened to get the design of the coach and the script of the coach. But so I'll go back into this in a minute. So we started with the fundamentals of the design. This was the psychological principles, thinking about presence, all those sorts of things. So that's sort of our first thoughts when we started work on this. And then we had first decisions. So this was, one of them was the environments, which again I'm going to talk about in a minute, how the LEAP worked on creating the environments. But it also was then looking at the environments and putting them into a matrix to make sure that there were psychological principles to match each environment. So the pub environment was about people being in a situation where they didn't know what would happen. So we need to make sure that was ticked off. But they could also match other environments, like people being, other psychological principles about people being close to them, being a problem, and noise, you know, that sort of atmosphere being a problem. So I don't know how many people here have run workshops and designed them. Got to see a couple of nods. It was pretty much as you would run most workshops, but because people have had lived experience psychosis and we needed to be aware and of that, there were a few things. So we made sure there was always a quiet space people could go to. So we had the main area and then a quiet space. The psychologists came with us to the workshops who work with people with psychosis regularly. So it meant that they could really describe the projects and talk about the psychological principles, as well as be there if people were feeling anxious and there was someone you could talk to about that. The agenda, I would always have set aims for each workshop. of what we're looking at. And I'd do an agenda, but I'd keep it quite fluid because you're never quite sure how much you'd get through, so you'd have to think of maybe new ways to get the same thing you wanted. So it stayed fluid throughout. And so quite a few, so I'd create quite a lot of things but then not use them. But that was quite interesting. And then the other thing was we had needed space for people to bring their family members or their support workers if they wanted to as well. They could be part of it. And everyone was given the opportunity to try virtual reality, and they did all try it, but it really wasn't pushed on people. It was an option that they could do or not. And we were lucky that Oxford had already created a therapy for anxiety, so we could use that as an example, so people could see what a therapy looked like, and then we could talk about designing it. And a lot of the work we did was on sort of solo brainstorming and then group work, so we could have that point where people who didn't feel confident speaking in public could get their thoughts across. Plus also some of the discussions afterwards were really useful. So when it came to designing the environments, we worked in the workshops on this, and we also sent out a questionnaire, but it was sort of, they couldn't be too nice, they couldn't be too nasty. It was sort of a general environment that you'd see anywhere, and again, couldn't be too London-centric. And with the character design, it was having characters who could trigger anxiety, but also just how many characters in that space would be a problem, and how close the sort of proximity of people, how do you build that up? With the task design, again, we did a questionnaire, but also we did one workshop looking at the cafe where people put post-it notes on different areas of the cafe, things that would happen in the cafe that would cause them anxiety and sort of trigger problems. And what was interesting in the process, some ideas that came out, we'd look at why those did, so we could then maybe change them to other environments if they didn't work in the environment they initially were talking about. And we did a lot of work on the script as well. This was partly looking at the language the coach would use, so it wasn't patronising. That word came up a lot. We don't want it to be patronising, and words like sort of well done didn't always work. But it was looking at how people wanted to give encouragement, how they would give encouragement to their friends if they were doing it. So it's sort of getting quite natural language. And so I'm just going to give a couple examples in more detail about how things were created. So the environments were done in McPinn ran a workshop early on with the Lived Experience Advisory Panel, and they looked at what caused them anxiety and also the social situations they wanted to be in but weren't confident to be in at the moment. And then it sort of voted on a top 10 list of those. From that, the psychologists and the developers looked at it and thought, we can't always develop everything everyone wants. So how can we create environments that fulfill these things that are in the top 10? So the 6 environments that were chosen sort of, while not necessarily always matching word for word what people had asked for, they fitted with what people wanted. And the next example I'm going to talk about is the coach design. So we did a workshop where we looked at what people would want in a virtual coach, what would they find supportive. And also the developers wanted to know if a coach could be, if it had to be a full-bodied coach, or if it could be in a sort of like a iPad-sized thing, or if it could be voice-only. So we did quite a lot of work on that in the workshops. And the voice-only went straight away because people who are hearing voices don't want a disembodied voice. It wouldn't work, it wouldn't be good. So, but then quite interesting, we went for the full-bodied because that was everyone's preference. But there was an interesting one where someone actually quite liked it in that sort of space because it felt like they could call on the coach when they needed them. It was like a pop-up, like having that phone. So it's interesting to get people's response. So I'm going to go back to this diagram again of the coach and how all the different meetings that went through it. And the first thing I've put in here is things that aren't connected to the workshops. It's sort of the design research, the desk research, the analysis we did from the workshops, and the prototype. So that was all part of it, the design decisions, and the brought knowledge. And I think what was quite important for me, as a designer, you come in with your preconceptions of what you want to design. And I sort of put those and wrote those down at the beginning because I think you will always bias what you do, and I didn't want to overly bias what was coming back. So I wanted to make sure what my preconceptions were so I could put those to one side and then actually listen to what people were asking for and why they wanted it. So through June, July and August, we had a series of meetings, and you can see the first one's an all-partner meeting, and each meeting there's an aim. We had inputs from different places and outputs, and you can see the inputs then become, the outputs become the inputs for future meetings and future workshops. So you can see early on it was a lot of partner meetings, but then we had a workshop, then another partner meeting, and then another workshop. So it sort of went back and forward like that, sort of iterating through September and October. So through September, we really sort of, that's when we decided it was going to be the full body. Then through, I think it was started in the Nottingham workshop in September, then in October in Manchester, it might be Manchester, we last started to look at the script and what the coach should say. And then that continued through November and the partner meeting. And in December, we had a meeting with the LEAP where we talked about the script and also the coach and made final decisions. So it was just before Christmas break, we handed in all the documents, all the design documents. So for the implementation of this, I worked quite closely with Oxford VR and with psychologists from University of Oxford on, once we knew what the tasks were, we had to map out the task flows to make sure that everything worked. A lot of this was done on paper. I just did drawings, see where people would stand. And we also did use lucid charts to do flow diagrams so we could see where it branched. So if someone didn't complete a task, what would happen? But we also mapped out, so this was a mapping out of the bus, so we could actually see what does it mean if someone takes a step in VR, because we don't know the space that this would be delivered in, so we needed to make sure that one step wasn't too much, that it was within a certain area, but how far could actually someone get into the bus. And also it's things like the person has to pay when they get on the bus, which hand is the card for them to pay going to be in, is it going to be there all the time, so we could just act out those things to see what worked. And we also created prototypes. I was going to show a video, but I won't now, but this is one of the prototypes of the bus. This was partly a game for us to work out what it would be like in that space, the sizes we could go in there, but we could also take these to workshops. So as it developed, we could actually start showing people what it was going to be like in Game Change. And then we created design documentation. This is a sort of overhead animation of one of the tasks, but we also created design documents for the developers that listed what happened in a task, the psychological principles for that task, what the coach was going to say, what other interactions with characters there would be, what objects needed to be picked up, what sounds, these sort of important things. So as the developers went through, if they needed to make a change, they could see the reasons why we'd put something in there and to see the importance of it. And if they had to make a change, it would match with the psychological principles. And then there was user testing. So it was sort of in the original plan that we had to sort of get 90% on usability and sort of engagement within it. So we started user testing, looking at, first of all, the glitches within the virtual reality application. But then it started just before the clinical trial started. The user testing, we got that sort of 90% that people did find it engaging and usable. So what's happening now and what next? The clinical trials are taking place at these 5 cities in England. They are running, probably they'll finish later this year, so hopefully around this time next year we should get the results on how effective this virtual reality treatment is. The other work packages, my work package, the design development is pretty much done, so I'm now working on a paper looking at sort of writing up what we did, but also sort of looking at other research. But the other work packages are still looking at how this can be used within the NHS and how the sort of road to that is. But what I found quite interesting, I was doing the design with people with lived experience of psychosis. Another organisation, Mindtech, they were working with the people who were delivering it, doing similar things, running workshops with them to see how they wanted it to be formed and how they would deliver it. So it wasn't just sort of pushed on them at the end. It was really thought out about how they would deliver it and they were comfortable with delivering this therapy. I don't know if people run workshops, often questions come out that are really interesting that haven't been researched, and especially in virtual reality, there's a lot that hasn't been researched. So over this next year, I'm going to be looking at some of those questions that came out of the workshops. One of them was sort of how people can see how they're doing in a VR therapy in VR, so how they can track their progress. And you can find more information about the project, that URL, and it's also on Twitter. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Indira. Now we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience. We've got like 15, 20 minutes, so go ahead. Who's got questions? Yeah, go ahead, stand up, say your name, and speak into the mic.
Hi, I'm Johnny. I do user research myself. Very interested in how you were able to get that discovery phase, get that user, understanding the user needs in a way that did not invoke trauma. I could imagine how this could be a traumatic moment to ask, what are these trigger points? How did you kind of get that information and make it in a way that you make sense of it?
Yeah, I mean, it was very important that people felt comfortable in the workshops. What I also realised that people who have had psychosis were really invested in finding a treatment for this because they've been through it, and so they were quite keen to do this. So McPinn Foundation sort of put out notices to find people, so they knew what was going to happen when they came. As I said, we put things in place that people could leave at any time. People could bring their support workers. It was having that safe space. We also, if people didn't want to speak, we would work with them when they're writing, doing their brainstorming, so we could speak their words for them if they didn't want to speak them themselves, so they could get heard. We had places where people could just put up post-it notes if they didn't want to speak, so everything was captured. And I think having the psychologist there meant that there was someone they could talk to, because it is, I mean, virtual reality anyway can cause problems for people. You can get motion sickness, there can be different things. But it was making sure that there were things in place that if something was triggered, there was the support there for them. But actually through the process, as I say, everyone did try it in the end. And I think everyone, though not everyone liked it or thought it was good, none of them found it a negative experience.
Hi, my name is Joel. I'm a product designer, and I know that in app development, there's a lot of like give and take. So I'm wondering if there are any things about a game change that still keeps you up at night.
Not anymore, no. It's been a while. I mean, you do get quite invested in some of the ideas that can't be made. And when you're developing, particularly because it was such a short development time, things couldn't go in. But in a way, that's led to research. And one of the things that came out that we couldn't put into VR, which was how could people sort of record what they're going to do. We actually ended up doing an extra workshop looking at the treatment outside VR, how it was delivered, and the materials, written materials that people could do. So there's often a way, if you can't use it in technology, some of the work went into non-technology and sort of creating a booklet where people could write their thoughts, because some really interesting things came out of the workshop around that, which had been a shame not to include, but we could include them in the end, non-technology.
All right, coming up.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I'm a software engineer. So I was wondering, given that the problem that you're trying to solve is very complex and broad, and the solution that you delivered is very detailed down to where the user is going to stand, were there any assumptions that you had going into the design or development phase which were later proven to be incorrect, or any edge cases or blind spots that in retrospect you realized that you had missed?
I think we'll know more at the end of the trials if there's something we've really missed on. Because unfortunately I keep sort of saying how the trial's going and they can't tell us because it's trial and they won't, they have to keep that secret. I think going in, I definitely had assumptions because you come in with a design background and you're used to making in a certain way. And particularly VR comes a lot from gaming and those sort of thoughts, but it's very slow. I don't know if anyone's tried a therapy VR in here. I tried a PTSD one as well, and they are very slow. It's not about sort of action, and it's about people staying in a space and them having to be there. And I suppose the other assumption is you have all these visual ideas that you want to implement, but actually when you're working with people with psychosis, you have to be really clear what is meant to be there, because with the hallucinations, it needs to be clear that this is what you're meant to see. So we had to make sure that we didn't use sort of colours or sounds in a different way, because we were going to sort of use colour to represent things and different sort of points. But actually, you need to keep it quite simple, or quite not simple, but quite realistic in how you do it.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm a UX researcher. I have two quick questions. One, it might be the limitations of VR. I don't know a lot of VR, but it didn't look hyper realistic. But I wonder if there's a benefit to that and making someone feel more safe in the space.
What's interesting in VR, and I don't know if this will change as VR is used more and more, is it's more important that it feels realistic than looks realistic. So it actually triggers your mind even if it doesn't look that realistic. What's interesting with the game change therapy is it is actually a lot more realistic than a lot of other therapies. But when we were doing the workshops, what people didn't like was when the movements were wrong and the facial expressions were wrong, and they were far more important than, say, what the environment looked like. So I found that was quite interesting.
And then my second question is, were there levels? You were saying that people could track how they're doing, like how far you stand from me. Does that get closer or anything that as you progress?
Yes, so there's a cafe where you're in a queue going to order a coffee, and that definitely, so when you start, you're there on your own, and then there'll be people behind you and they're closer to you. So it is that sort of thing where there'll be more people and they'll be closer to you as it goes on.
Xian?
I want to say a quick hi to Thomas, who I know is creeping on the streaming. Definitely couldn't miss your wonderful presentation, Indira. So first of all, I want to thank you so much for sharing. I feel like I learned a lot. I don't know about you guys, but anyway, I am always curious, and I think, first of all, the fact that this is sort of what I always tell developers, corporations, that they need to work with the populations in need closely. And I mean, it seems like you created so many layers of protection and really tried to embrace feedback. I'm curious, what was something that you were surprised by, or that you would take into a future situation that you learned from? I mean, obviously it's 6 months you had, so I'm sure there were a lot of learnings, but I first want to commend you. I'm curious who came up with this. Was this your idea? Was this a group of people saying this is the best way to do this? But it
was actually, the head of my team came up with the idea for the working group. I think that was probably one of the things that for me was the best thing that came out of this, and I would definitely do again. We hadn't planned it at the beginning, and it meant that people with lived experience of psychosis were involved throughout the design process. So it wasn't coming in at set points and sort of testing things or even sort of asking for ideas. It was really became that point where you're part of a team all working together with the psychologists and the developers, and we all got to know each other. We had the same people often coming every week, and I think you need that continuity. You need lots of different people because you need lots of different voices, but you also having that one group, that is something I'd definitely do again. And also even just the weekly calls. I know it sounds really small, but just having weekly calls between the developers, the designers and the psychologists meant we could get questions answered really quickly, and they could go back to people in their organisation who'd quite hard to get hold of sometimes, and we could get information back. So I think those are the two things that for me worked well that I didn't expect.
That's wonderful. Bravo.
Hello, my name is Shaishav, and I make 3D models like the ones that you saw there.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you something very specific as a patient. So for example, there must have been some very generic levels for everybody, and there must have been some very specific levels. So I wanted to ask you if you can give us an example of each of them. For example, I don't mind being outside, but when I get into an elevator, and if there is no one, then I'm anxious. If there are 10 people with me, then I'm anxious. I'm okay with 2, 3.
Yeah.
So if I come to you with a specific issue like this, how would you tackle that?
Yeah, I think this is why we tried to, with the 6 different environments and 6 scenarios. This is why when we worked with people lived experience at the beginning and they came up with 10, we tried to include those 10 in the environments to make sure that there would be an environment. So people don't have to do all the environments. They can pick the one that they want to do and the one that causes them anxiety and that they want to be in. And I think that's quite important because at the moment it isn't tailored to a specific person. But, if it's the closeness of people in the cafe is a good one because you're having to stand there and you're having to order. If it's there's a shop where you have to go and buy things and you have a list of things you have to buy, so that can cause anxiety. They then got to queue and there are people waiting in the queue behind you and it's very slow. So we tried to create different things so hopefully whatever someone's anxiety is, there will be something within it that would trigger that and that they could work on. But I think because the nature of it at the moment, there might be people who think that there isn't something there, but I'd imagine for most people there'd be something within it that would help them.
Question, one in the back.
Hi, my name is Jen. I'm a UX designer. So I'm curious about, this is about accessibility, but I'm curious about actual access. What about people who are neurologically diverse but have a lower income level or don't have, their access to mental health care is not ideal. So do you have a contingency plan for
I
those
suppose
people?
this is slightly different to the US because this would be delivered within the National Health Service. So it's free at the point of entry to anyone. But saying that, even the National Health Service, as I said, there's only 5% of people getting psychological treatment now. And it isn't always easy to get mental health treatment within the NHS. You have to, you'll go to see your doctor. You might have to wait months to get treatment. So it isn't sort of all great over there that you get it straight away. And if you have money, of course, you can get it straight away. But I think with this treatment, we're hoping because it's relatively cheap, because it doesn't have to be recreated for each individual person. It's in a headset. It'll be peer support workers, because this actually came out of working with people who lived experience. They wanted peer support workers to deliver it. So they're recruiting peer support workers for that. So hopefully it means that this treatment there will be this treatment for more people, because at the moment, psychologists try to take people out, but again, it's quite limited about their time. So there shouldn't be a restriction on this going out into the NHS, though I haven't the people doing the cost evaluation looking at that. I think that's right. It's really important we have these different work packages with different expertise so they can actually see how it will work and what the costs would be for each NHS trust and how many people it could reach.
So a follow-up, putting economics to the side, a major issue a lot of these people face is leaving their house.
Yeah.
So they would have to leave their house to access VR equipment at a mental health care facility. Is there a contingency plan for that?
This is what I'm not quite sure. So as Mind Tech were looking at how it's going to be delivered, and when I was going to the workshops, they were talking about delivering it in people's homes or where they would deliver it. So I'm not sure what the final decision was on that, whether it could be taken to people's homes. But there are things around that, would they have the space, would they have the privacy to do it, you're using their electricity. So I'm not sure what the final decision was on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from the live stream. How can this type of VR therapy be applied to individuals with autism?
That's interesting. It's not an area I've particularly looked at, but I know there's a lot of work going on with autism and virtual reality. I've just been to a symposium in Nashville this weekend, and there was someone talking about a therapy they've developed because they worked with their child who's autistic and realized that through virtual reality, he started to play more and could learn about how to respond to facial expressions. So there is work going on in this area, and it is one of the sort of big areas for virtual reality.
Any additional questions from the audience? Yeah, over here.
Hi, I'm Aurelia.
Hi.
It seems like with this user group, you had to be very, very careful and did a lot of testing. I was interested in how you tested the script and whether you, with this user group, did you have to test more often and more carefully because they were, with disabilities?
I wouldn't say we had to do it more often. It was just to try and get a really broad amount of people from around the country. So that's why we did it at multiple places. So we could see how people in Manchester thought and what people in Nottingham thought. So it was that idea that just to get as many people with lived experiences input so we could start to really see patterns and make sure that it wasn't just one person who thought this. This was a reason and why those reasons were. With the script, it was interesting because the first time I did a workshop on it, I basically just had a series of questions that I asked people to first of all write down on post-it notes. And they're questions like, if your friend was having a hard time, what words of encouragement would you use to help them? What words really you don't like if someone's trying to encourage you? So it was really sort of basic questions around, not necessarily even in a therapy, but just in general life, how would you want encouragement? How would you encourage others? This then, we did the same when we went to, I think it was Bristol. We did those similar questions, but then I also created mock scripts that people could then fill in. So at the end, they started to write their own scripts. Again, we then did a sort of a partners workshop where we went through all of this and with the script writer and worked out. Then we took the script to the Leap to get their input on how they felt it was. Again, it was the most important thing was it wasn't patronizing. It made people feel it was their therapy, not they're sort of being forced into things and sort of slightly false, which again can be hard when you've got a virtual therapist who has got a set sort of script to say. So it's really important to get that tone of voice right.
Cameron, you all met me already. The use case you're describing seems like it actually is just kind of good for a lot of people, especially anxiety, right? Like so many people experience anxiety. And I'm wondering if the principles that you identified are universal principles. So for example, or could be, more broad than just psychosis. Do you think that I'm curious what you think of that. And also if there was anything that was specific to psychosis that would not translate well to a general population.
I don't know if I'd be fully able to answer that, not being a psychologist, but I know that a lot of it is around social anxiety. So it's interesting you saying about the elevator earlier. The therapy that we showed people that they're developing, they're doing the study at the moment, included an elevator. So it was for anxiety. And the ideas behind this are psychological principles that psychologists use for therapy. So one of them also was mirroring the idea that someone does it ahead of you and then you copy what they've done. So it used a lot of general psychological principles. But to be honest, I wouldn't want to answer fully, not being a psychologist.
Sure. I had a couple other questions, if I'm not, if I'm okay. So the methodology you came up with sounds very similar in a lot of ways to like lean methodologies and like design sprints. Did you look at those as examples, or would you consider using more formalized methodologies from like user-centered design or feedback and that kind of thing, lean design, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, this originally we'd planned to use a double diamond approach, which would have worked well, probably because our time was cut short. We ended up with a more iterative approach. But I've got a development background, so I quite enjoyed that iterative approach and found that having that constant, because we had to go between the different groups, having that constant feedback loop meant that it's just this slow design built up over time. I think it worked well for this project. It might not work for every project, but for me, it worked in that we got the most input from people with lived experience, and it was a way that we could bring everyone together as well.
For the non-technologists in the room, what's double diamond?
It's a no, it's fine. It's a user experience. Sort of, you've got diamond up and down, and then another one. So it's sort of define. I should have got a graphic of it actually. Sort of discover, define, and then so you start off small in the discovery phase, and you just go out big, and you're like anything's possible, and then you make that into a definition of actually what is it we're going to do. And then you go out again, how are we going to do it? And you go out again, it's sort of all big. And then you go down into the last end of the diamond, and it's going to go into, which does work really well. And I suppose in some ways, because a lot of this had already been defined, because we knew it was going to be a VR therapy, we knew it was going to be a coach and the sort of basic structure, a lot of that definition phase had been done. So probably that's as well why Double Diamond didn't work in this case.
Hello again. I'm curious as to the feedback loop. I know it's currently being evaluated in England. I'm curious if you had any feedback loop mechanisms in place of how reporting looks like and what progress looks like in the end.
Yes, so for the design, as I said, we had sort of this criteria of usability and engagement. So we got people, I actually haven't got them with me, a number of questions that they had to answer when they tried it, and to get basically positive responses to those. And it was things like, if you haven't used it for a while, is it easy to come back to? If you make a mistake, is it easy to rectify? That, you know, you can work out quickly how you're going to do that. So that was on the design side. We had sort of very definite, almost like usability questions. With the whether the therapy works or not, we won't know until the end of the trial, because we're hoping it will. And there are previous trials, that's the ones I mentioned in the talk, and there have been other ones, have shown that this therapy can work for mental health therapies, but we'll see if this one does.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, sorry, just one last question. When you had people with psychosis in your working groups during the design and development phase, how many people were there, and how did you decide on the right number of people for it to be a representative enough sample?
So, and there were people with lived experience, so most people weren't really ill still, so they were at the point of recovery and better. So that's in total, I think 53 people with lived experience psychosis were involved in the design of the project. When we ran the workshops, there was between 6 and 10 people. And in the weekly meetings, there was about 4. And in that, we'd have 4 people with lived experience. There'd be me as a designer and sometimes a colleague who was a designer. We'd have 1 or 2 psychologists, one of the developers, and normally someone from the McPinn Foundation came along as well.
Is there someone here? No.
Hi, my name is Brianna. I'm a UI UX designer. Thank you so much for this. My question is, if the trials don't go well by a certain standard, how will you iterate on this? What will change if that's the case?
Do you know, I'm not sure about that. We were funded for the 3 years, so this project runs in. I don't know if they came out and found there was something that didn't work, but it was a technical thing, I think that could be fixed. If it didn't work as a treatment, I think that'd be something different, and maybe they'd look at a different approach. But I don't know what would happen with the treatment as a whole if it didn't work.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you again, Indira. Please join me in thanking Indira Knight. Thank you. And again, expressing our gratitude from the meetup, and I think on the behalf of everyone here, thank you. And also the stream, there was a lot of gratitude expressed there. So in closing, something that I thought about in this when this talk came up was that mental health and cognitive differences are often something that we don't think about in terms when we think about accessibility and inclusive design. So I'm so happy that you've done this work. So thank you. And please, all of you, consider these methodologies, consider these topics when you're doing your work out in the world. One last time, a thank you to our sponsors, to Adobe and Adobe Design, and to Level Access, to Equal Entry, the Internet Society of New York, Accessibility Special Interest Group, and White Coat Captioning. I'm just nailing them. And thanks to all of you. So please hang out for a little bit if you'd like. I'll be here for another 20 minutes or so. So get to know one another. And yes, Sean.
Well, I was wondering if you were going to do any other announcements, because I did want to share something.
Sure.
I have it. Please. So, and Thomas on the live stream was actually the first signature I got. I wanted to share because I feel like this is a sympathetic group which will understand the importance of accessibility and transportation in general. I'm fighting to save a program which is the only same-day travel program in New York at the moment. The MTA is trying to cut us down from unlimited same-day travel options to 16 rides a month, only up to a $15 subsidy. For those that aren't aware, who here knows about Accessoride and how difficult that is? Okay, not too many hands. So a little background, if we have 2 minutes, is that in order to do the traditional blue and white vans that you see, you have to book 1 to 2 days in advance. So I just want everyone to imagine what it would be like if you had to book your subway or bus rides 1 to 2 days in advance. Yes, I did this for 20 years, and they essentially are cutting us down to 16 rides a month so that it forces us back into that. Think about those who are employed, especially if you're self-employed or freelance and you don't have the same 9-to-5 schedule every day. I can tell you from personal experience that they often will show up 1 to 2 hours late, and then it's a shared ride on top of that. You could go from New York to Queens to Brooklyn before you even get to your destination. The reason I'm saying all this is that basically the reason the petition exists is that I do not believe that if you are not requiring all New Yorkers to travel this way, you should not require that of any of us. And there's 161,000 people that will be ultimately affected by this. So if anyone wants to sign the petition, I will do it by hand here if you want. I will email it to you if you want to share it. So yeah, shameless plug, but I think very important. Thank you so much.
Thanks again. And on that note, so we'll share out whatever you've learned about today, insofar as there's materials that you'd like to share with the group. We can post it on meetup.com and find Sean and talk more about transportation in New York City, and and hang out and talk. Thank you.